Hey guys, today's episode is a bit different from our other ones since there was no kingdom or state with this exact name, and it's a matter of debate if there even was one ever planned. But we'll get into that later. First, let's start the episode. It's 18 BC, and a man is born who continues to be discussed among historians to this day. Most of the details about his childhood are unknown. Even his real name remains something of a mystery. We really have just a few facts. His father, Segimer, was Princeps Regentes Seius of the Cherusci. This title is generally translated as Lord, but literally means first among his people. And besides the Cherusci, there were other important tribes in the area, including the Chatti, Bructeri, Frisii, Marsi, and Marcomanni. Okay, so he was born somewhere in Germania, the exact location being somewhat unclear. But what is Germania? This is the Roman name for the territories east of the Rhine River, which possibly was borrowed from the Gauls, and for the Romans anyway, it was largely an unknown and sparsely populated territory. Now, getting back to our story, Segimer's two sons were brought to Rome at a very young age. During these times, it was completely normal for the Romans to take children from befriended or subjected tribes in Germania and elsewhere to Rome. This happened for two reasons mainly. Number one, to have hostages so these tribes wouldn't rebel against Rome. And number two, to let these children grow up in the Roman manner. So in the best case, you would have a Romanized tribal leadership in the future. And this pretty much is what happened to the Cherusci since they were a vassal of Rome. But first, let's talk a bit more about the relationship between Rome and the various Germanic tribes. Here, though, we get to the first issue in discussing this topic. Was there a people actually called the Germans? Well, it's hard to say. In the region, there were dozens of tribes, each of which spoke a different type of Proto-German language. That being said, they did have a common religion. It was polytheistic and quite similar to that practiced in the Nordic regions during the same time period. Despite this, the Germanic tribes were not one people, and intertribal warfare was quite common. This is why it was rather easy for the Romans to gain a foothold and later vassals in the region. The first contact between the Romans and Germanic tribes, at least those between the rivers Rhine and Elbe, took place during the Gallic Wars. The Suebi, a Germanic tribe, crossed the Rhine, raiding Gallic territories while Gaius Julius Caesar was in the region. At the Battle of Vugis in 58 BC, the Suebi suffered a crushing defeat and retreated back across the Rhine. To teach them a lesson, Caesar ordered a bridge to be built over the Rhine, which his legions did in less than 10 days, and the Romans continued to pursue the fleeing Suebi deep into Germania itself. Satisfied, Caesar concluded his punitive expedition, returned to Gaul, and destroyed the bridge, thereby preventing other Germanic tribes from crossing over. The Romans eventually built a series of border fortifications west of the Rhine, but there are signs of early trade with some Germanic tribes. Despite this, quite a few remained hostile to the Romans. They were, nonetheless, too fragmented to stand united in opposition to Rome. A couple of tribes, though, like the Chatti, did try confronting the Romans on their own, but they were quickly and rather not unexpectedly defeated. The Roman military juggernaut was simply too powerful for one tribe. Okay, so that's a bit of background. However, almost all primary sources we have originate within the Roman Empire itself, which unfortunately makes it very hard to obtain an objective point of view here. The Germanic tribes didn't keep any records, in fact, most didn't even know how to read or write, so a lot of Germanic customs, beliefs, and history unfortunately are likely lost to the ages. But let's return to the son of the Cheruscian leader, Segimer. As previously mentioned, he was brought to Rome and would go on to spend most of his formative years there. He almost certainly adopted most Roman customs and eventually became a Roman citizen. Unfortunately, there isn't much information pertaining to his life in Rome, but we can assume that coming from a rural village in Germania, Rome must have been an awe-inspiring sight for him. And as much as I would like to just continue saying he and him, we probably should talk about his real name. Roman sources call him Arminius, but that probably wasn't his real Germanic name. More than 1,000 years later, he was called Hermann the Cherusker, but since that was, 1,000 years later, we can only speculate about his real name. His younger brother, who was also taken to Rome, received the name Flavus, but aside from that, we know almost nothing about him. However, we do know that Arminius later became a leader of the German auxiliary forces in the Roman army, and that was not a position just anyone could get, so he probably led a rather privileged life in Rome. Arminius would later serve with distinction in the Great Illyrian Revolt of the 1st century AD. Following this and other exploits, he gained the title Equitus, which is something akin to a knight and the second of the property-based classes in Roman society, just below that of the senatorial class. Overall, it sounds like Arminius led a pretty successful life in his adoptive Rome. Why should he ever turn against it? Well, perhaps success is not everything that a person wishes for. It's unknown when exactly Arminius returned to Germania, but it most likely was sometime between 7 and 8 AD. This occurred following an effort by Emperor Augustus to establish a province known as Magna Germania, centered around the Roman colony of Colonia, modern Cologne. A man called Publius Quintilis Varus was then appointed by Augustus as the first official governor of the new province, and so Arminius came along as commander of the Cheruscian detachment of the Roman auxiliary forces. Upon his arrival, Arminius witnessed the implementation of Roman law in the province, which resulted in those tribes under Roman control being forced to abandon their customs. For instance, it was no longer the tribe or tribal leaders who decided what punishment was merited for violating the law, but rather Rome. And since Roman laws were being implemented, many Germanic people found themselves to have violated laws they had never even heard of before, something a great many came to resent. Don't forget, most of the people in Germania couldn't read or write, and therefore were not often aware of Roman announcements and official decrees. Now, add to that forced and excessive tolls along with a strong Roman military presence in the area, which to be exact amounted to 3 legions, and you can sort of understand the growing tension. FYI, 3 legions being equivalent to 18,000 soldiers. Admittedly, that doesn't sound too big nowadays, but for the time it was a considerable force. Caesar, for example, conquered Gaul with just 6 legions, and Gaul was bigger, more organized, and had better infrastructure than Germania. In total, Rome possessed 25 legions, most of them being stationed in various provinces to prevent possible uprisings. Moreover, Governor Varus was said to be rather exploitive of the German people, and it seems that he was not the only Roman in the province who behaved in this manner. In fact, it was Roman sources who accused the Romans of various misdeeds, and the tribes probably viewed Varus even worse than the Romans did. Some 200 years later, the well-known Roman historian Tacitus condemned Varus's behavior in Germania, claiming that he had attempted to wipe out the customs of the local people. So, because of this, and after seeing the dire situation of many Cheruscians, Arminius switched sides. This was not as easy as it sounds, though. There was a deep mistrust of his intent here, and Arminius did not have the unwavering support of the Cheruscian leadership. That being said, since he was the son of Segimer, his voice carried weight. Still, many believed that Arminius had just wanted to gather the Germanic tribes around him in order to create a new kingdom of his own. After a while, though, he managed to gain enough support for a general uprising, but the Germanic tribes remained divided. Arminius, however, put all his hopes into one assumption: the Germanic people hated the Romans more than they hated each other. A Congress of Tribes was organized in 9 AD, which resulted in a short-term alliance between the Cherusci, Chatti, Bructeri, and Marsi. However, Arminius knew that in battle on flat terrain, the Romans would easily defeat the united tribes. Their tactics, professional army, and artillery equipment would prove devastating in any such confrontation, so rather, he came up with another course of action. He wanted to attack the legions while they were crossing difficult, narrow terrain, in which the Roman forces would have no choice but to walk in loose formation. Since just a couple of men would be marching side by side, their formation would be stretched thin, probably over a great distance, and communication would be difficult. As such, the Roman army wouldn't be able to coordinate a proper defensive formation to a surprise attack in such a vulnerable state. Based on this, a plan was devised to attack the Roman legions when they would be returning to their winter encampment. The coalition then set about spreading rumors of a possible uprising, which in turn lured the legions into a location chosen by the tribes. Since Arminius had still not openly sided with the Germanic tribes, and the coalition was held in secret, there was no reason for Varus to distrust him. Arminius was still a commander of the German auxiliary forces, and his knowledge of the region's people, culture, and terrain was invaluable to Varus. Even when warned about a possible traitor and enemy movements, Varus brushed aside such concerns. And this would prove his biggest mistake. Arminius was leading the Roman army into a trap. But first, just a quick call to action here. If you like the channel and want to help us grow, consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. You can also comment and like this video, that helps with the algorithm as well. And yeah, let's get back to the video. What followed was a chaotic battle, and while the exact location is unknown today, many historians believe it was somewhere near Kolkriese in western Germany. Germanic warriors hiding in the forest attacked different parts of the perilously overstretched Roman army, which now stood somewhere between 9 and 12 miles, roughly 15 to 20 kilometers in length. Before they could even respond to the initial attack, the Germanic forces strategically pulled back, only to emerge elsewhere, attacking the legions from multiple points. It is also claimed the German warriors used hallucinogenic mushrooms for a heightened sense of awareness, which made them fight more fiercely. Think like a berserker from Lord of the Rings. They may have also painted their faces and wore bear or wolf skins. All that being said, none of this can be definitively verified since there are too few primary sources on the matter. Later known as the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, it nonetheless marked an unprecedented military defeat for the Roman Empire. Legions 17, 18, and 19 were completely routed. Just a few soldiers survived and almost none of them made it back to Roman territory. Varus committed suicide in the heat of battle, and nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers died, the precise number of Germanic casualties being unclear. What exactly happened to those who survived, however, is debated. Some claim that the surviving Roman soldiers were tortured and then killed. Some may have been enslaved. For his part, Varus probably committed suicide, as I just mentioned. But none of this is known for sure since, sources, or lack thereof. This crushing defeat, however, dissuaded the empire from continuing its expansion into Germania, greatly altering the course of European history. And, on that note, Roman historian Suetonius later cited Emperor Augustus as being so overcome with the defeat, he repeatedly shouted, "Quintilis Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat resounded throughout Roman society. Yes, the empire still likely had enough soldiers to conquer Germania, but at what price? There was no infrastructure, a rebellious population, and the cost just didn't seem to justify the gains. And so, the Romans abandoned their plans for Germania. But what happened to Arminius and the Germanic tribes? Well, it seems they tried capitalizing on their newfound initiative and crossed the Rhine into Roman territory, but as Roman reinforcements arrived, the coalition quickly withdrew. Arminius later sent the decapitated head of Varus to the leader of the Marcomanni, Marbod, the Marcomanni being one of the largest tribes in Germania. He tried forming an alliance with the Marcomanni, but Marbod returned the fallen general's head to Rome, preferring to stay neutral in the conflict. Over the following years, Arminius's anti-Roman coalition gained some new supporters among the other Germanic tribes, and that was certainly needed since the Romans were then preparing to send a new expedition to Germania. A successful Roman general and later emperor, Tiberius, along with his nephew, Nero Claudius Germanicus, soon gathered 8 legions and crossed into Germania. They more than likely had no intention of conquering territory, but rather, this was to avenge the legions that had fallen at Teutoburg and crush the Arminius-led German Confederation. Germanicus, the leader of the expedition, had 8 legions under his command, or about 45,000 soldiers. Arminius's coalition had probably somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 warriors at their disposal, so their forces were comparable, at least in size. The campaign finally started in 14 AD, and bit of a side note here, but this is the year Tiberius became emperor as well. The Roman army moved swiftly through the Germanic territories, sacking and plundering villages. In the opening days of the conflict, most battles were indecisive, but in 15 AD, the Romans did manage to recapture one of the 3 legionary eagles lost in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. They retrieved another the following year, which also marked a serious blunder for coalition forces. In 16 AD, the coalition planned to attack the winter encampment of the Roman legions. Arminius, however, strongly opposed this course of action, believing that raids on less organized legions as they moved about had proven more than effective. But the coalition leaders decided to attack regardless and suffered heavy casualties. A series of battles were fought after this, the vast majority of which didn't go well for the Germanic Confederation. The last of these being the Battle of the Varian Wall in 16 AD. The Romans prevailed here too, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, and following this, they retreated for Roman territory. Arminius, for his part, experienced personal loss in the conflict, with his then pregnant wife Tusnelda being captured by Germanicus. She later gave birth to a son who grew up in Roman captivity, but Arminius would never see either of them ever again. Following this, the coalition remained intact. However, many tribes again accused Arminius of wanting to establish a new Germanic kingdom with himself as king. Arminius' popularity declined further, and the tribes once again began to distrust each other as well. In 17 AD, the coalition went to war with the Marcomanni. The exact reasons are somewhat unclear though, and to illustrate this point, during the conflict, the Lombards and the Seminoes, allies of the Marcomanni, switched sides, joining Arminius' coalition. Arminius' uncle, Inguiomer, would, however, join the Marcomanni. Arminius proved victorious over the Marcomanni, who then retreated to Bohemia. So, in 18 AD, with the Roman threat having apparently been dealt with and their biggest rival tribe out of the area, we could assume things went alright for the coalition going forward, right? Well, no. The coalition, which had grown considerably since its inception, soon began to fragment without an external threat. Arminius, whose popularity had steadily declined, was still by far the most prominent figure among Germanic leaders, but many feared that Arminius was becoming too powerful. In this vein, the Chatti offered to poison Arminius, but Emperor Tiberius rejected the offer. Soon though, rifts began to emerge within the coalition between pro-Roman and anti-Roman tribes. And 2 years later, in 21 AD, Arminius was killed by members within his own tribe. After his death, the coalition quickly fell apart, and with Arminius, the idea of a united Germany died, for the time being anyway. Hey, as always, thanks again for watching this episode of Ghost Countries. The German Confederation is a really interesting chapter of European history, even though there is a noticeable lack of sources out there. It seems like Arminius had the idea of a united Germany in mind, but we can't be certain about this. Nonetheless, I think it's kind of fascinating to see this early proto-unification attempt in what was then Germania, and how in later history this would play out for Germany itself, post, HRE. Arminius was, and in many ways continues to be, a German national hero, and there is actually a huge statue of him in the Teutoburg Forest. And with that, peace.